New Historicism and Collaboration versus French Historicists. Why French Shakespeare studies are ignored. New Historicism seeks to understand the cultural context of literature, which requires an understanding of the political, religious, and literary activity of the age, the big picture. However, how Shakspere learned multiple foreign languages and had the political liaisons to know so much about European literary trends, religious and political intrigues is never addressed. New historicists just assume Shakespeare knew everything, perhaps thanks to his well-placed friends. However, as Diana Price points out in Shakespeare's unorthodox biography, we have a startling lack of any written record indicating that anyone ever saw or knew the famous writer Shakespeare while he was alive. The soul of the age is strangely missing. This dearth of information about Shakespeare has led new historicists to simply ignore Shakespeare's unexplainable absence, now brushed aside with one word: collaboration. Literary collaboration, another relatively new literary theory, maintains Shakespeare was a bit of a literary impresario passing plays among a coterie of writers. Yet again, there is no paper trail, not a single reference to any collaboration with Shakespeare. In 1918, the French scholar Abel Lefranc said that it was quite possible that Shakespeare's plays were rewritten by other authors before being presented to the public in order to remove politically sensitive material. Furthermore, Lefranc observes the plays may have been updated over time by other writers without Shakespeare's input. Lefranc's theory would explain why there is no record of any collaboration with Shakespeare. There was none. Still in its infancy, stylometry may eventually prove the plays were reworked, but stylometry cannot prove the plays were written in collaboration by multiple authors until we find actual proof of collaboration. New historicists ignore the first historical Shakespeare studies because they pose insurmountable problems for new historicists, especially the studies of Abel Lefranc, a member of the Académie Française, and his protégé Georges Lambin. Abel Lefranc wrote 4 volumes on Shakespeare. The most important are Behind the Mask of William Shakespeare in 2 volumes, 1918-1919, and that of Georges Lambin, who wrote Voyage de Shakespeare en France et en Italie in 1962. Reviews of Abel Lefranc and Georges Lambin's studies are almost non-existent. When found, they are dismissive and avoid addressing the historical facts these studies reveal. Thanks to Frank Lawler's superb translation of Lefranc and soon-to-be-released translation of Lambin, it will be harder to continue suppressing these French studies. However, if tradition holds, nothing will change, and the English translations will simply be ignored because for the Shakespeare tradition to survive, French scholarship has to be ignored. The most obvious problem for Stratfordians is that there is nothing in the historical record to indicate that Shakespeare knew French. Hamlet is based on François Belforet's untranslated story of Hamlet, not translated into English until 1608. However, Hamlet was performed in Oxford in 1593, as documented by an historical plaque discovered by A.D. Joly. Traditional academics have theorized that Shakespeare must have started to learn French when he roomed with the immigrant French Huguenot Montjoie family, probably in 1602, but certainly by 1604. This insurmountable problem of Shakespeare's only possibly beginning to learn French until 1602 or 1604, a decade after Hamlet appeared on the stage, led to the creation of the Ur-Hamlet theory, which maintains that Shakespeare must have seen a play about Macbeth written by an English author who knew how to read French, most probably Thomas Kyd. Shakespeare then wrote his own play about Hamlet inspired by Kyd's play. The problem with the Ur-Hamlet theory is that there is no record that Kyd or anyone else wrote a play about Hamlet that was then lost. Major scholars like Harold Bloom abandoned the Ur-Hamlet theory, but others have not. In addition to the influence of Belforet's Hamlet and Montaigne's essays, political aspects of Hamlet have recently been unearthed by academics Julie Maxwell and Richard Hillman. Hamlet was used for Catholic propaganda with its inherent message against the ever-increasing danger of regicide. In addition, the Kalmar Union of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway was in political disarray because of religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants, which threatened the rest of Europe, including Great Britain, also a union of three countries, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Hamlet's existential angst acquires a frightening international dimension at the end of the play. Another insurmountable problem for Stratfordians is Shakespeare's amazing knowledge of French. In Shakespeare's day, French was not understood by the general populace and was only spoken by the highest levels of the aristocracy. Shakespeare uses French words instead of English words. Travis William recently proved Shakespeare read Montaigne in French because Shakespeare uses Montaigne's French word bourne throughout his work. This appropriation means Shakespeare read Montaigne in French because Florio always translates bourne as boundary throughout his translation. Shakespeare uses puns that requires a knowledge of French. Sometimes Shakespeare even uses the French rather than the English meaning of words. He creates a wealth of neologisms based on French. Shakespeare even created a new vogue of using French words. 18 of the plays have French sources, and the sonnets show the influence of Dubartas and the Pléiad poets. Shakespeare had a deep, ingrained knowledge and love of the French language, which he used to enrich Renaissance English. He also had access to French texts, which were not readily available. There were no public libraries, and foreign texts were expensive. Love's Labour's Lost was influenced by Pierre de la Primaude's L'Académie Française, published in 1577, translated in 1586, in which four young men meet to study, but religious wars force them to disband. In Love's Labour's Lost, the students' studies are disrupted by the arrival of a princess. In 1578, the Catholic princess Marguerite de Valois traveled to Nerac with her entourage to negotiate a reconciliation with her estranged Protestant husband, King Henry of Navarre. Their interfaith marriage had been arranged with the hope it would stop the fighting between French Protestants and Catholics. But in 1572, only 2 weeks after their marriage, the St. Bartholomew Day massacre in Paris ignited the slaughter of Protestants throughout France. Henry of Navarre, the new groom, became a prisoner and only managed to escape in 1576 when he fled to his kingdom of Navarre. King Henry III and his mother Catherine de' Medici decided to reunite the young couple with hopes the reunion would stop the continuing French religious warfare. When Marguerite arrived with her entourage in Navarre, Henry of Navarre forced them to wait before receiving them, which is what we see in the play. Act 2 opens with a detailed discussion of the princess's dowry, with reference to payment, non-payment, and the dowry of Aquitaine, revealing Shakespeare was incredibly and inexplicably knowledgeable about details dealing with the dispute over the prince's dowry. None of this history was put into print until Marguerite's memoirs were published in 1628. Shakespeare's cast includes the major historical figures who represent the different factions in the French religious war. Shakespeare uses their historical names with anglicized spelling. Biron represents Charles de Gontaut, Baron de Biron, called the Thunderbolt of France, who was well-liked but capricious, just like in the play. Biron, a close but unreliable friend of Henry of Navarre, represents the mercurial ally and the potential traitor feared by all political movements. Longueville represents Henri d'Orléans, Duc de Longueville, who was a member of Les Politiques, the political faction that believed supporting the state, the king, was more important than supporting a religious denomination. Dumaine represents Charles, Duc de Mayenne, the last of the Guise brothers, who directed the Catholic anti-king faction. When Henry of Navarre became King Henry IV of France, Dumaine made peace with him. The King of Navarre represents Henry of Navarre, leader of the Protestant cause, until he became King of France. Shakespeare changes the king's first name to Ferdinand because it was illegal to represent a living monarch on stage. The name Ferdinand is the first clue the play has more than one level of interpretation. A politically informed Renaissance audience associated the name Ferdinand with the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand, who struggled with religious wars not only between Protestants and Catholics, but also between Christians and Muslims. The Ottomans reached the gates of Vienna in 1529. The Austrian-Ottoman Wars continued until 1664. The association with religious warfare in Eastern Europe casts a shadow over the frivolities of the play taking place during Catholic and Protestant warfare in the West, in France. Because of its literary and artistic accomplishments, we tend to forget the Renaissance was a world on fire fueled by religious warfare. Shakespeare also presents a startling number of secondary historical characters. The description of the princess as the tallest and the thickest matches descriptions of the Princess Marguerite. Boyer, referred to as Marguerite's solicitor, denigrated as an old love monger, and Cupid's grandfather is a description that matches that of Guy de Fort de Bribac, Marguerite's treasurer, an older man who tried to woo her only to be rejected and belittled because of his age. Catherine is the name of Henry of Navarre's sister, Catherine de Bourbon. Marie suggests Marie de Bourbon, a member of Marguerite's entourage in Nerac, and Rosaline echoes the name of Rose de Montal, known as one of the most beautiful members of Marguerite's entourage. Of the play's many historical figures, Richmond says it is Shakespeare's genius to have copied, not invented, such psychologies. Don Adriano de Armado mirrors the name of Agrippa d'Aubigny, an eccentric gentleman who was in charge of court entertainments and spoke Spanish like Don Adriano de Armado. Moth's name reflects the name of the French diplomat de la Mothe Fénelon, a character also found in Midsummer Night's Dream. La Fosseuse, you see here, Jaquenetta's pregnancy alludes to Henry of Navarre's impregnation of one of Marguerite's ladies-in-waiting, Françoise de Montmorency Fossu, known by her nickname La Fosseuse. Jaquenetta is also a nickname. It derives from Jacob, meaning to supplant, which is exactly what happened in Nerac when the lady-in-waiting supplanted the queen in the king's favors. Lefranc discovers even more historical details. Lord Biron and Lady Rosaline refer to their previous meeting in Brabant. The reference reveals Shakespeare knew Marguerite went to Brabant just before going to Nerac. She supposedly went to take the waters, but she was actually on a secret mission to promote her brother Alençon's claim to the throne of the Netherlands. Yet another surprising revelation about secret French political activities. The trip to Brabant moves back the timetable even further to 1577, 2 decades before the play was supposedly written. There is also a very puzzling reference to a girl in Brabant who dies of a broken heart. He made her melancholy, sad, and heavy, and so she died. Lefranc discovered that this is yet another story told in Marguerite de Valois' memoirs published in 1628, the shocking story of Mademoiselle de Tournon, who stunned the French court by dying of a broken heart in Brabant within days of being rejected by her beloved. This story is also referred to in Hamlet. The events in the play take place between 1577 and 1583. Traditional scholars believe Love's Labour's Lost was written between 1594 and 1595 and no later than 1598, that is 12 to 20 years after the events depicted in the play. None of this history was written in 1598. Marguerite's memoirs were only published in 1628. Who would remember these references to political events and minor French figures a decade or two after they occurred with no written history to consult? With Europe in a constant state of war on multiple fronts, nobody would remember or care about negotiations in Nerac. There is obviously a problem with the dating of Love's Labour's Lost, just as there is for Hamlet. The historical sources of these plays indicate they were written before the dates they were assigned based on Shakspere's life. In Act 5, the French noblemen appeared disguised as Russians, accompanied by blackamoors playing music. Queen Elizabeth's order to deport all, quote, nagars and blackmoors, unquote, make it clear that at that time, a blackamoor was not a Negro, but referred to the Moors who were darker skinned than the Europeans. A politically informed Renaissance audience would have immediately sensed a chill in the air with the exotic combination of Moors and Russians, a chill which would have made the frivolities of Nerac seem egocentric, even delusional. The Moors burned Moscow to the ground in 1571 in an ongoing conflict which continued until the 18th century. The conflict between Christianity and Islam was not limited to Russia. It endured in Spain until the expulsion of all Muslims in 1614. In the Netherlands, Protestant Catholic religious wars continued from 1568 until 1648, and in France from 1562 to 1598. This association between the warring religions of Christianity and Islam in the east of Europe mirrors the Protestant Catholic conflicts in the West. Throughout the 16th century, all of Europe, east and west, was devastated by religious warfare. Religious wars were an existential threat to European civilization. Because we have forgotten the history, these historical associations are lost to us. The French called the Seventh War of Religion La Guerre des Amants, the Lovers' War. The Treaty of Flakes, ending the war in 1580, was called La Traité des Amants, the Lovers' Treaty, names which may have influenced Shakespeare's title of Love's Labours Lost. The astonishing number of historical French figures with their actual names, the accurate description of Henry's initial refusal to receive Marguerite and her entourage, the details about the dispute over the dowry, Margaret's secretive political trip to Brabant to help her brother Alençon, the shocking story of Mademoiselle de Tournon, who died in a few days because of a broken heart, the reference to the Russians and the Blackmoors, the title of the play, which mirrors the French nicknames, the Lovers' War and the Lovers' Treaty, the reference to the nine worthies, tapestries Henry de Navarre brought to Nerac for Marguerite, the description of the location, hunting, the king's bizarre letter-writing habits, and his horsemanship, the presentation of masks. This mass of historical information presents a very thorny problem for Stratfordians, as well as the dating. How does the Folger address this historical background of Love's Labours Lost on their website? In the Folger's main article on Love's Labours Lost, Carroll asserts, quote, the play is situated at a complex historical moment which in some ways still remains obscure. Several of the characters' names reflect French prototypes, but convincing historical parallels go only so far, and in most cases, persuasive evidence of specific connections is lacking. To claim, quote, persuasive evidence of specific connections is lacking, unquote, is an unexcusable academic failing for anyone familiar with Lefranc's work. The Folger has a very short article by Emma Poltrack, which honestly states that there is no explanation for how Shakspere would have known about the play's historical figures and literary influences. She says, while it is certainly possible and even likely that he, Shakespeare, drew on some of the historical materials listed here, we lack that tantalizing journal entry in his hand. Dear Diary, today I read a great new book by Peter de la Prémaudet, and it gave me a great idea for a play. Unfortunately, we not only lack that journal entry, we also lack Shakespeare's journal. A second article by Poltrack says that Navarre, Baron, Mayenne, and Longueville are likely reimagined as Ferdinand and friends in Shakespeare's play. However, no historical explanation is provided. The Folger's solution is simply to ignore the history, which is what Stratfordians have done with any studies that make Shakespeare's authorship dubious. Needless to say, the failure to look at the plays in their historical context is an unforgivable academic failure that limits our understanding not only of the plays, but also the complexity of their artistic creation. In 1962, Georges Lambin published Voyage de Shakespeare en France et en Italie, which is just as ignored by Stratfordians as Lefranc's book. The opening of Measure for Measure depicts a debauched Vienna. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs, was not known for debauchery. For Shakespeare's audience, Vienna brought up associations with the powerful Catholic Habsburgs and their struggles against the Protestants and the Ottomans, just as Shakespeare alludes to the developing scope of religious warfare in Love's Labour's Lost. The Duke's name, Vincentio, refers to Henri III, the French king's early military victories, as well as to the English diplomatic courier that reveals the Bois de Vincennes is referred to as the Bois de Vincennes rather than the Bois de Vincennes, where Henri spent a lot of time in religious retreats or diabolical rites, according to his enemies. The Duke's rumored departure for Poland refers to Henri's brief reign as King of Poland until the death of his brother Charles IX. To do penance, Henri would dress as a monk and flagellate himself. Ludovic, the name he assumes disguised as a monk, refers to Henri's ancestor, Saint Louis, King Louis XI. The actual setting is Paris, not Vienna. Lambin discovered that Measure for Measure was inspired by a French law case which illustrated the political chaos in France in everyday affairs. The case was that of Claude Tonnerre, sentenced to death in 1582 by corrupt Parisian officials for an illicit sexual relationship despite a marriage agreement. Returning from one of his monastic retreats, the French King Henri III was informed about the Tonnerre case. Historical names mirrored in the play include Claude, Claudio, Jérôme Angenoust, Angelo, appointed as administrator before King Henri left on his religious retreat, just as in the play, Flavius, the historical La Roche-Flavin, president of the Parisian Chamber of Inquiries, who presided over Claude Tonnerre's case and found him guilty. Varius, representing Guillaume de Vere, a parliamentary advisor known for his common sense, and Valentinus, representing Henri III's Protestant counselor Guillaume Robert de la Marque, the grandson of the legendary Diane de Poitiers, the Duchesse de Valentinois. Roland refers to the English Richard Rowlands, a Catholic palmist, forced to flee England for France after printing a booklet depicting the physical tortures Queen Elizabeth inflicted on non-compliant Catholics. Bernardine refers to Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador to France, who aided the extremist anti-Henri Catholics with money provided by the Habsburgs. Bernardino's plotting was so notorious, Henri III is for Bernardino's recall. Because the Pope and the Guises protected Bernardino, Henry dared not harm him. Scene 2 of Act 4, in which the Duke Vincentio, disguised as a friar, gives up trying to get Bernardine out of his cell, mocks Henry III's inability to do anything to rid himself of Bernardino, who was actively working to overthrow the French king. Ragozzina, the pirate who died in jail and whose head replaces Claudio's, refers to the papal legate Regazzoni, who impeded English endeavors to arrest Thomas Morgan, who had plotted to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. Aeschylus, whom the Duke Vincentio chooses to settle disputes, is an ironic reference to Jacques de Lévis, Comte de Caylus, who arranged the infamous Quarrel of the Minions, in which many of Henri's minions were killed. The mature, thoughtful, public-minded Aeschylus represents the exact opposite of Caylus, who incarnates the lack of authority and chaos at the French court, which was run by the king's young minions. Lucio represents François d'Espiny de Saint-Luc, who fell into disfavor with Henri III for his indiscretion and impertinence, just as Lucio falls into disfavor with the Duke. Henri III arranged Saint-Luc's marriage to a hunchback. The Duke arranges Lucio's marriage with a prostitute. Shakespeare even alludes to Saint-Luc's full name, François d'Espinay de Saint-Luc. Espinay has as its root épine, which is a thorn. Lucio tells the Duke, "Nay, friar, I am a kind of burr I shall stick." Shakespeare subtly mocks not only the debauchery of Paris and its king, but even that of its nunneries, with a trove of historical information about the rules of the Order of St. Clare, a French order of nuns abolished in England after Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. It is puzzling that Shakespeare would be familiar with the rules of this French order. The Folger erroneously asserts that in 1964, G.K. Hunter was, quote, probably the first, unquote, to recognize the importance of Shakespeare's adherence to the rules of St. Clare. Lambin made this observation in 1962. The Folger cites Darrell G. Gliss, quote, "It was in fact possible for Shakespeare to have seen the manuscript of the rules of St. Clare because Charles Howard, Earl of Nottingham, patron of the Admiral's men, had a copy which he donated to the Oxford's Bodleian Library in 1604. The year Measure for Measure was probably written. Because there are no records Shakspere was ever at court, Glass' assumption applies as easily to Oxford as to Shakspere. Howard and De Vere were both earls with theater troupes. To follow Glass's reasoning, therefore, it was in fact possible for De Vere to have seen the manuscript of the Rules of St. Clare. The 1604 date Stratfordians assigned to the play is 22 years after the unpublished story took place. Who would still be talking about this unpublished French story in England 22 years after it happened? Tonnerre's story was not published until 1621, well after Shakespeare's death. Once again, there is no way to explain how Shakespeare could have known all these minor French historical figures. Once again, the dates assigned to the plays based on Shakespeare's life fail to be convincing. Shakespeare's knowledge of French, the performance of Hamlet, the many French historical characters in Love's Labour's Lost and Measure for Measure, the discrepancy between when the events took place and when the plays were supposedly written make it impossible for anyone with an open mind to believe that Shakespeare was the author of these plays, as Lefranc observed in 1918. New Historicism is opening new doors, addressing the amazing international political complexity of Shakespeare's plays while carefully avoiding the obvious chasm between Shakespeare and the linguistic and political knowledge required to create plays with an international reach we are only now beginning to fully comprehend. New Historicism can help strengthen authorship doubts because the subjects it covers are so cosmopolitan they defy Shakespeare's restricted education and missing social connections. The Shakespeare myth is eroding, smothered by its own incredible improbabilities. It is our responsibility to make sure the authorship question is not buried and forgotten by those who would like it to fade gently into that good night, still cloaked in its tattered mythology. Merci, thank you.